Jim Rutenberg writes the Mediator column for the New York Times. Let me share with you something he wrote here. Here's how he begins. On Valentine's Day in 2001, the heads of the major television news networks went to Capitol Hill to answer hard questions about the poor job they had done on Election Day. This is the Al Gore, George W. Bush contest. In a buck stops with us moment, these heads of major television networks were resolute about doing better. And they were contrite. Even the Fox News founder and chief executive Roger Ailes, a famous bully who rarely shied from a fight, said, quote, "We let our viewers down. It will not happen again," end quote. See what I mean about liars? Now, the reason the network chiefs were there, because they were in the hot seat about their election night coverage that had contributed to the chaos that occurred. You remember that one of George Bush's cousins had been hired as a special consultant to Fox for election night. And when the major networks declared that Al Gore had won Florida, which would have made him president, George Bush's cousin said it wasn't true and went on the Fox network and said, no, that's not true. There's still ballots being counted. So the major networks retracted the statement they'd made about Gore winning. And by the time the smoke cleared, the ballot counting in Florida had stopped. And the U.S. Supreme Court said it would stay stopped. And that's how George Bush became president. He was never elected. Arguably, the same thing happened in Ohio 4 years later when Bush ran for re-election. But it was 2001, the election in 2000, that was just the mind fuck. That's when, on December 8th, 2000, when the Supreme Court ordered the ballot counting to stop, that was when representative democracy in this country took a knife right in the fucking heart. In the months that followed, the news organizations agreed on the basic facts, if not on every detail. And under bipartisan pressure from Congress, they moved swiftly to fix their flawed election night projection system. Look at us now. As the country grapples with a still more serious affront to American democracy, the agreement on the basic facts in the mainstream news media does not extend to Rupert Murdoch's media empire and other important parts of the conservative media. This is the case even as the special counsel, Robert Mueller, bears down in his investigation of the Russian efforts to sway the 2016 presidential election. As Mr. Mueller and his team home in on people connected to Trump, including his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, the president and his allies in the conservative media are pointing at the Democrats and Hillary Clinton. Adding to the problem is the recent behavior of the tech companies, which have not shown the same desire for accountability exhibited in 2001 by Roger Ailes and his fellow network chiefs all those years ago. On Tuesday, when Congress called Facebook, Twitter, and Google to testify, those companies sent their lawyers, not their top bosses. Yeah, the lawyers provided some details about how Russian operatives had reached scores of millions of Americans with divisive and misleading messages. But that was only after Facebook's founder, Mark Zuckerberg, insisted in November that it was all bullshit. Oh, that never happened. What he said was a pretty crazy idea that Russian operatives had used Facebook to influence the election. Now, the latest number that Facebook has put out there of Americans who were exposed to Russia's divisive content in these fake goddamn ads, 126 million people. In the days leading up to the indictment of Manafort and his lobbying partner Rick Gates, they saw fit to question Mueller's legitimacy. They did so while arguing that the real focus should be on Mrs. Clinton, the Democrats, and a political research firm that commissioned the gathering of information on Trump's ties to Russia, the company named Fusion GPS. The counter-narrative was particularly pronounced in the outlets controlled by Mr. Murdoch and his news and entertainment companies, 21st Century Fox and News Corporation. On Saturday, just past, the Fox News host Jeanine Pirro called for the jailing of Mrs. Clinton, saying, quote, "It's time to shut it down, turn the tables, and lock her up." End quote. This Fox sewer dweller claimed that, quote, "the Obamas and the Clintons had built the Trump-Russia connection," end quote. She was pointing to a report in the Washington Post that the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee had helped finance research by Fusion GPS, which produced a dossier describing ties between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. What the Fox sewer dweller did not mention was a report in the New York Times that a conservative media organization, the Free Beacon, hired Fusion GPS to research Trump and other Republicans. This is before Trump got the nomination. The most salacious findings in the dossier, based on information collected from sources inside and outside the Kremlin by a Fusion GPS contractor, the former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, those findings remain uncorroborated. This is one about Trump dancing in a shower of urine coming from Russian female sex workers. Also on Saturday, just past, the New York Post columnist Michael Goodwin called for Mr. Mueller's resignation, citing Fusion GPS as well as Mueller's previous job as an FBI director under Obama. Given that in the Mr. Goodwin, the columnist's view, so much of the investigative focus must now fall on Mr. Obama's administration. Foreshadowing Mr. Goodwin's dubious argument was an editorial in the Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal, which declared that Mr. Mueller, quote, "lacks the critical distance," end quote, to look into the allegation that, quote, "Democrats paid for Russia to compile wild allegations about a U.S. presidential candidate," end quote. Jesus, bleeding Christ. Look how they just turn it around. Wall Street Journal. The editorial also questioned whether the dossier had triggered the FBI inquiry into Mr. Trump's campaign. But that investigation began in July last year. James Comey, the FBI director at the time, told Congress in March, not long after Fusion GPS's financing passed from Republican to Democratic sources. And while skepticism is a virtue for all journalistic endeavors, there is no evidence to support the assertion that the Democrats hired Fusion GPS with the purpose of getting Russia to spread wild allegations about Mr. Trump. It's just the reverse, right? Everything that these filthy Republicans did was to spread wild allegations about Clinton. As John Cipher, a former CIA chief of station, pointed out, intelligence tends to come from sources within foreign governments. He said, quote, "Reaching out to Russians and Americans to try to collect information on what might have happened and then pass that information to sources in good faith, that's different from trying to conspire with Russia to get stolen emails from the United States," end quote. The Democrats did the former, the Republicans the latter. And that's because Republicans are no longer Republicans. They are American Nazis. They have no honor, no respect for anything. They're filth. The collective coverage, Rutenberg goes on, the collective coverage from the Journal editorial page, the New York Post, and Fox News was testament to the Murdoch Empire's ability to make its own journalistic weather. They make shit up. They just make shit up. And then the asshole screams fake news about everybody else. Between the promotion of alternative narratives, that's the difference between truth and bullshit. Between the promotion of alternative narratives, bullshit, and the way the social media platforms have been so slow in describing their inadvertent hosting of the Russian effort, there's a striking lack of national unity over what appears to have been a foreign incursion into an American election. Half of America doesn't fucking believe it, no matter how much evidence is presented. So you have to wonder, Rutenberg writes, how the country will ever come together to do something about it. Sean Powers, Executive Director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, who has spent years studying what he calls the geopolitics of information, said, quote, "There's this epic lack of consensus or active dissensus. At this point, everybody in the United States old enough to vote should know that the Russians deliberately, with malice aforethought and a specific plan, hacked into, I'm using that term with quotes around it, hacked into our electoral process and destroyed it. Fucking destroyed it. That is simple truth. And yet half of Americans don't believe it and will never believe it. And that's why this country is in its death throes, as we know it, as is presently constituted. The United States, is fucking dying. When you get to that big of a schism within a country where massive, monumental proof of tampering by a foreign government in our election is stacked up against massive, monumental lying, and the lying captures half of the American public, this fucking country is over. I mean, come on. That's not me talking. That's reality talking. If we can't agree 100% that a foreign government made every effort it could to destroy our election and thereby destabilizing the country and eventually causing its collapse, if we can't agree on that, what the fuck can we agree on? Nothing. Nothing. And the entire blame of this rests on the backs of these right-wing sons of bitches, with Murdoch, with the Washington Times, with this shithole Breitbart, all these different right-wing organizations, all the little squirrels that run around in the Fox sewer television studio and broadcast their lies and their deception. That's where the responsibility for the end of this country lies. Sean Powers, the guy I just quoted, is confident, though, that as the facts come out, the country will find a way to fend off similar attacks. For example, he said Facebook, Twitter, and Google are adding new policies to combat false information, fake accounts, and nefarious foreign political advertising. BFD. Rutenberg says, but I can't help thinking back to 2001. On Tuesday, I called Tom Johnson, the former CNN chairman, who was one of the executives who appeared on Capitol Hill to testify in 2001. He said some colleagues had some qualms appearing before Congress, given the First Amendment implications. But he told me that he had felt it was the right thing to do. He said, quote, "I still think we have the very highest public responsibility to make sure we get it right, and when we don't get it right, that we try to determine what went wrong and what we can do about it. It really gets down to operating in the public interest," end quote. Oh yeah, that. Operating in the public interest. How quaint. How last century. How inoperative. Operating in the public interest.